If you look at the frieze above the doors to the state capitol building, you will see what is perhaps the most central activity of the people in New Haven. By May 1665, New Haven had been consolidated into the state of Connecticut, which had previously consisted only of Hartford and Old Saybrook. Here, on the screen, you see people gathered, united to worship. The frieze shows Reverend Davenport preaching in New Haven. Davenport's views constitute a central building block of Connecticut and American political thought. In the previous Part 1, you saw how freedom of expression was tied to elected assemblies, which required and protected such freedom to obtain optimal advice. Now, in Part 2, we will see how Davenport defined the entity of New Haven, and I will make the argument that he created the basis for meaningful separation of church and state in America. In Part 3, we will summarize Connecticut Puritan thought and the contribution of the Winthrops in a conclusion entitled Connecticut City on a Hill.
The Reverend Davenport originally decided to call the city of New Haven New Jerusalem. Davenport set out to create something new. He understood that despite the name, it was necessarily imperfect. It was man's creation. Davenport also understood his flock sought salvation, and they understood salvation required they fulfill a God-given universal duty. They thought about this many times every day. The settlers pictured in the frieze wanted a new life. Not just new in meaning another entity as in a second York or second London. It aspired to be new in the sense of higher and hopefully holy. As you can see from their attentive expressions, those gathering to hear the gospel preached believe they are hearing truly holy words. Much of what Davenport thought is from the Gospel of Matthew, the prophet who said,
"Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always, to the very end of the age."
Davenport saw his duty was to go to the wilderness and preach the gospel. Immediately after landing in New Haven Harbor, Davenport went to what is now the Green. He held service, and the readings there were from Matthew 3 and 4. It is the part about John the Baptist, the one where God commands us to go to the wilderness and spread the good news of Christ's coming. But there, Christ meets the devil, and that very real force creates defining challenges and temptations. In response to what he believed was a holy calling from prophets such as John the Baptist, a calling to lead into the wilderness, Davenport then laid out New Haven in 9 squares in imitation of Israel's settlement in the wilderness. And he thought of himself as leading a people without land into a land without people. The unsettled land to the north was called Bethany, the place where Christ passed through on his way to the wilderness. But in fact, we know this area was where many Native Americans had lived for centuries, and their trade routes crossed in New Haven. As detailed in his sermons, Davenport stressed the purpose of life as a Christian believer was to achieve salvation. And as set forth in Matthew, God made it clear all had to pass through a truly narrow gate to achieve salvation. Davenport's God is actively focused upon man's choices, just as the God in the Founder's Orders is. And how does his God do this? He constantly watches men's conduct. It's a process. As Matthew promised, Jesus will be present at the very end of the age. And at that end moment, as set forth in Revelation 16, Jesus will save only the faithful. Choice is therefore critically important, for only the right choice leads with God's grace to salvation. Davenport's emphasis on choices led him to explain in detail how civil societies should be structured and should function. He outlined a vision of church and state, and importantly, he modeled their separate identities in descriptive detail, in a new Connecticut controlled directly by the people's representatives. As described in Part 1, only white male members of the church could vote for these representatives. To understand Davenport's vision, it is necessary to first understand its background, including the bloody Civil War which occurred in England. This foundational period from 1639 to 1660 is one in which Connecticut leaders came into contact with a transformed English society with ideas for change, which struck at the very heart of previous assumptions of divine rule, and which greatly influenced their structuring of Connecticut law. For them, Connecticut was in an end time in which God was in charge, but no longer in charge of the English state through its ruler. By 1639, the English King Charles was challenging the power of the English church leaders, and a decade later, by 1649, his head lay on the scaffold and Parliament ruled. This process produced a very, very bloody civil war. At the same time, culture underwent radical transformation. England's greatest minds began to create English political philosophy. The state wasn't any longer an instrument of God through its king. Thomas Hobbes wrote his major work, The Leviathan, which is concerned with freedom from interference from his fellow man in a very violent society. John Locke developed his theory of representative democracy, which assumed individual inalienable rights. For more details, you may view my video, which is entitled The Second John Locke, and which also exposes his views on slavery. John Milton worked for the English parliamentary leader Oliver Cromwell in the 1650s, and he then composed his famous poem, Paradise Lost, which poses the question, who is the devil in an age where parties kill each other in the name of the good? Milton's poem challenged binary thinking. By 1661, many of those who supported the king's execution fled to Connecticut, where they had some close friends, such as Davenport.
How much these regicide leaders influenced Connecticut is the subject of considerable self-censorship, and their presence began a forgotten quest. Obviously, the regicides went to a cave at West Rock, New Haven to hide, but they were fed there by local supporters. They must have said something to those who helped them and their cause. Davenport wrote in support of the regicides, and he put one up at his place for 8 weeks. Oliver Cromwell was the military leader for the English parliamentary cause and also head of state from 1653 to 1658. His historically central place in English history and English government is either ignored or barely mentioned in Connecticut history.
As Davenport led his congregation in his quest for a new Jerusalem and also saw the old order destroyed as King Charles's head lay on the scaffold floor, he laid out new concepts of civil and spiritual society in his sermons. His vision was of two kingdoms, a spiritual one and a civil one. God was the author of both. But for him, there are two separate aspects to God. He is creator and he is also redeemer. Christ is the head of the spiritual church, but not of the civil one. Davenport says,
God, as the creator and governor of the world, is the author of civil order and administrations.
Thus, importantly, the state itself is not holy. In fact, Davenport holds there are morally just heathens who should occupy positions of power when the Christian group is not a majority. He says,
Heathen man or meet civil politician will be good enough to be their magistrate.
Davenport then goes on to elaborate a vision of two separate, clearly defined kingdoms, one spiritual, the other civil. He says that the
members of the Church of Christ are considerable under a twofold respect answerable to the twofold man which is in all members of the church whilst they are in this world, the inward and the outward man, whereunto the only wise God hath fitted and appointed two sorts of administrations, ecclesiastical and civil. Hence they are capable of a twofold relation and of action and power suitable to them both, viz. Civil and spiritual, and accordingly must be exercised about both in their season, without confounding those two different states, or destroying either of them, whilst what they transact in civil affairs is done by virtue of their civil relation, their church state only fitting them to do it according to God.
Much of Davenport's reasoning echoes that of early Greek and Roman philosophers, particularly Aristotle. Like them, he describes the form of a particular object and deduces its proper function. For example, a knife has sharp edges and therefore is used to cut things. The purpose of the inner, the spiritual kingdom is to obtain salvation with God's grace. The outer kingdom, civil law and government, is desirable if it produces order and peace. He counseled,
Be wise, therefore, ye rulers, and consider that your life And all your good, your prosperity and protection lies not in this or that politic design or whatsoever else under the sun, but alone in God's gracious presence with you.
Davenport's pragmatic legislative process valued trial and error to achieve positive results. He said,
If upon revisal of your body of laws anyone be found to be unjust and oppressing, let it be expunged.
What, then, should be taken away from Davenport's writings on elections and civil affairs? Most obviously, he outlines a new practical means of preserving church and state. He is not only saying there should be freedom of religion, he is saying the state has no business in matters of the church and religion. Again and again, he emphasizes the state's limited purpose is to prevent fighting. This is what its creator wanted.
Copyright 2025 Peter A. Treffers, 661 Quinnipiac Avenue, New Haven, Connecticut. 06513. Mailing address: Peter A. Treffers, P.O. Box 395, Mashantucket 06338. Email: cthstv@gmail.com.